If anything, this is a moment of opportunity because we can make a very strong case for why diplomacy has to be a central element for our strategy towards China, because we have clearly not a strong enough ability to communicate effectively with the Chinese during a crisis. And imagine what this would look like in a conflict. Imagine what this would look like if nuclear weapons were at all involved.
That's the voice of Sahil Shah, Senior Fellow and Program Manager at the Council on Strategic Risks. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here's your co-hosts, Tom Collina and Lauren Bellett.
Thanks, Jacqueline, and welcome back to Press the Button. Lauren, how was your weekend?
Hi, Tom. My weekend was busy. I spent a lot of time hanging out with family and watching movies and just eating really yummy food. It was great. How was yours?
Glad to hear you had a good weekend. I had a very quiet weekend, hanging around the house, doing this and that. Very relaxing.
Very nice. I'm so glad that you got some relaxation. That's so important with all the busy work that we have. But Tom, what's the latest on the nuclear front?
Well, last week's big news, of course, was that the United States shot down a Chinese spy balloon after watching it drift slowly across the country. And the Biden administration got a lot of criticism from Republicans in Congress for waiting so long to act, even though the balloon posed no obvious threat. And we'll talk more about that whole episode later in the show. But for now, just since Friday, the United States has shot down 3 more mysterious objects, presumably also connected to balloons. The first was on Friday over Alaska, the second on Saturday over Canada, and the third over Lake Huron. And all were shot down by U.S. fighter jets, and all appeared to be different from each other, flying at different altitudes. So we can reasonably ask, what is going on? And a couple of conclusions that I've gleaned just by reading the media on this. First, after the Chinese spy balloon, the U.S. military is watching the sky a lot more closely. So, not surprisingly, they are seeing more things. This doesn't necessarily mean that there are more objects up there, but that we're seeing them and therefore have the opportunity to act. Second, given the criticisms from Congress, the Biden administration has decided to shoot first and ask questions later. They're simply no longer willing to take the criticism that they've been getting from Congress. And third, we don't really know what these things are because they have not been recovered yet, as far as we know. They were shot down in areas that are hard to reach, and they simply haven't recovered the evidence to see what it is. But officials are not ruling anything in or out. These could be from China or not. They could be alien UFOs or not. They're simply not saying. But one thing that's interesting is that this seems to be the first time within the United States airspace that the military has shot down an airborne object. So they're taking this quite seriously. Now, for China's part, they have claimed responsibility for the first balloon, but not the others. Beijing claims that their balloon was for scientific weather-related purposes, not espionage. And China is now saying that the United States has sent at least 10 balloons into Chinese airspace since last year, which Washington denies. And the Biden administration says that the Chinese balloon was part of a military-led spy program that covered more than 40 countries. So, to sum it all up, we have more questions than answers. But so far, the new balloon wars have taken a toll on U.S.-China relations. And now that we are looking for them, we can expect more balloon sightings in the days ahead. And Lauren, what do you have lined up for early warning?
This week on Early Warning, Alex Hall sits down with Connor Murray of Council for a Livable World. They discuss the prospects for negotiations to follow on agreements for the New START treaty and the implications for arms control if the U.S. and Russia fail to find consensus before the treaty expires in 2026.
And then I talk with Sahil Shah, Senior Fellow and Program Manager at the Council on Strategic Risk, and we discussed the Chinese spy balloon and how it led to the postponement of a high-level U.S. visit to Beijing that was ironically meant to improve crisis communication between Washington and Beijing. And it's a great conversation, so please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us to improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now,
Early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning.
a 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Jacqueline. In its annual report to Congress on implementing the New START treaty, the State Department concluded, unsurprisingly, that the U.S. could not certify that Russia was in compliance with New START obligations. On-site inspections had been paused due to the pandemic and remained paused indefinitely due to the war in Ukraine. Then, in November, Russia also postponed a meeting for New START talks, which was meant to take place in Cairo this winter. The New START treaty is due to expire in 2026, and there is no follow-on agreement currently in place. So the big question now is, what does this mean for the future of arms control between the U.S. and Russia? Today, we are joined by Connor Murray, Advocacy Coordinator at the Council for a Livable World. He recently authored an article on this topic titled, "There is no alternative. U.S.-Russian nuclear arms control must restart now." Connor, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So in a recent statement, Russia has stated that the United States, quote, inappropriate actions would make New START's implementation unjustified, untimely, and inappropriate. Given this, is there any willingness, you think, in your view, from Russia to engage in arms control?
Well, thanks again for having me. And I would start off by saying that Russia's actions in this context right now are extremely worrisome. There's no question about that. The United States and the Biden administration have shown willingness to isolate arms control from what's happening in Ukraine and from larger geopolitical developments. And that same willingness to date has not been shown by the Russian government. I think the suspension of on-site inspections, as you mentioned, as well as the postponement of those talks late last year are two perfect examples of that. But I think at the end of the day, the Russian government will realize that arms control is also in their interest, because without arms control, we could return to a world where there is unconstrained buildup of nuclear weapons. And that is not a world that the United States nor Russia want to be in.
So you mentioned the Biden administration's willingness to engage on this issue, but do you see an appetite in Congress for negotiating on anything that involves Russia at this moment? And do they have any say or involvement in this process?
So I'm going to take the second part of your question first, which is what is Congress's role. So any formal treaty, including New START, has to be ratified by Congress. And New START was ratified and went into force in 2011. But that does not mean that Congress is required to do anything with arms control. So I agree that willingness right now is low. We've already seen some members of Congress jump on these comments, including the State Department report, to try and walk away from arms control in general. And that's why organizations like Council for a Livable World, along with other partners here in DC, are working really hard to educate both members and their staff on the importance of arms control. And it's actually the importance of arms control is why our organization was founded over 60 years ago. There are alternatives to a formal treaty that could be put in place in the interim to show that we are serious about arms control without a formal treaty being in place before the expiration in 2026. I think two areas to target immediately would be a resumption of on-site inspections under New START, as well as a resumption of the conversations under the Bilateral Consultative Commission, which you mentioned previously. Those two steps would show a willingness to both countries that they are serious about arms control, and we need to get members of Congress to support that and provide the space for the Biden administration to feel that support.
So what's at stake if we don't make progress on arms control between the two countries, both immediate concerns with Russia and the US, but for the wider arms control efforts that you alluded to?
Yeah, so as I mentioned a little bit before, what's at stake is a potential return to unconstrained nuclear weapons buildup. New START is the only remaining treaty between the United States and Russia limiting their nuclear arsenals. And the Federation of American Scientists put out reporting this week that says that right now, without building any new nuclear weapons, the United States could increase its deployed arsenal by almost 2,000 warheads and Russia by almost 1,000. That is without any new investment, any new weapons, and is already a hugely concerning increase. But it's also, without the treaty in place, not stopping the United States and Russia from going beyond that and building up to even larger levels. During the peak of the Cold War, the global nuclear weapons arsenal topped 70,000 warheads. And that is, again, an extremely concerning astronomical number that nobody wants to return to. One more thing that I would probably want to include as well is to say that the United States and Russia are the two largest nuclear weapon states in the world. They still, to this day, are in control of more than 90% of global nuclear weapons. But in an unconstrained environment without arms control agreements in place, other countries might get nervous and might also start considering increasing the sizes of their arsenals in order to keep pace, whatever that means.
Thank you for all of your work on this, and let's hope that we can get back to the negotiating table on this soon.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Shing, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at Plowshares Fund. We work tirelessly to reduce and eventually eliminate the dangers posed by nuclear weapons, and we're able to do this because of the generosity of supporters and listeners like you. 100% of your tax-deductible gift will be used to support the smartest people with the best ideas. Go to plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
Last week, the world watched as a Chinese spy balloon slowly floated across the United States, passing over nuclear weapons facilities along the way. After much hand-wringing, the balloon was finally shot down off the coast of South Carolina. This should not have been an international crisis, but the sad state of U.S.-China relations and sharp partisanship in Washington made sure that it would be. Hawks in Congress demanded that President Biden take strong action against Beijing. The response was so over the top that Biden felt he had to do something, so he canceled Secretary of State Tony Blinken's scheduled trip to China. This trip, ironically, was intended to reduce tensions between Washington and Beijing. Soon after came news reports that China, for the first time, had more long-range missile launchers than the United States. While true to a point, it was often overlooked that many of the missile launchers are empty, and that the United States still has a nuclear arsenal that is many times larger than China's. Both episodes show how polarized the China debate has become, and how this makes it much harder to take steps to fix the situation, such as talking directly to Beijing. Today we're joined by Sahil Shah. He is a senior fellow and program manager at the Council on Strategic Risk, and he recently wrote an article for Foreign Policy magazine called "The United States and China Still Need to Talk About Nuclear Weapons." Sahil, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Tom. Good to be back.
So give us your sense of the Chinese spy balloon. What was Beijing really trying to do?
So far, it's difficult to ascertain based on what we know, what the Chinese were trying to achieve with this specific balloon. And I hope we will be able to glean more information about the balloon's collection abilities to fill in that picture over the coming weeks. But I think, what's clear is that this is part of a much wider constellation of reconnaissance efforts being vamped up by the Chinese, whether that's through satellites, cyber intrusions, or now balloons. We know that the Pentagon has said that this balloon was hovering over sensitive military sites. So in terms of what they were trying to do, we can safely bet that they were trying to surveil strategic sites, including potentially strategic bases, but we don't know in what way yet, and therefore why they were doing this is seemingly unclear.
Balloons have some advantages, but China would have had a lot of this information if it hadn't sent this balloon because of its satellites. So do we have any indication of why China would take this kind of a risk for seemingly incremental information?
That's a great question, and I don't think that we necessarily have enough information yet, again, on the balloon's collection abilities to know why they would opt for this balloon or even having such an advanced balloon effort in general. But the fact is that it's no secret that spying is a part of great power competition, whether now or in previous eras like the Cold War. Trying to gain a comparative advantage by having as much information as possible on your adversary's effort is nothing new. But, spying does sometimes go left. And that often happens because your efforts are discovered. And having a giant balloon that is visible to the public floating over the continental United States, it definitely seems bizarre. And I can understand why a lot of people would think, well, what's the point? This must be some sort of misunderstanding. Maybe the Chinese are right that it's a weather balloon. But I trust the Pentagon's assessment. They've been able to study the balloon and also past balloons in great detail. And the size of it indicates that it was there for other reasons and that we need to get a better sense once we recover the balloon of what exact technologies it was equipped with.
Now, as you said, this is not a new situation. The US and China spy on each other all the time. So other than the fact that we could see it in real time, slowly crossing the country, what made the response in this case so intense?
Definitely a great question. I think it's important as we try to stay as clear-eyed as possible that we don't make a false equivalence between the kind of ongoing reconnaissance efforts by both sides and what China did by sending this balloon and then completely denying the type of balloon it was or its motivations for doing so or taking any form of accountability. And I think that the US response was indeed intense and it could have been a lot more intense. But I think I understand why Washington reacted the way that it did. And as a result, why the Biden administration felt that it had to do something. The US, by policy and in practice, does not violate Chinese sovereignty. And in this case, the Chinese violated US sovereignty by intentionally overflying the US and then lied about it and continues to lie about it. And I think this is why the US responded. And just for context, was a response that was much less intense than how the Chinese have reacted, for example, when the US has operated aircraft and vessels in internationally recognized waters off China, including during the Hainan incident in 2001, but also other incidents since then. And unlike the Chinese government, the US government in this case attempted to reach out and discuss the matter with Chinese officials, but it sounds like those calls either weren't answered or they weren't answered by anyone who was empowered enough to really give any information or clarity. So this situation, first and foremost, is significant because even in the larger scheme of US-China competition, tensions, etc., it was a very clear violation of US sovereignty. But in addition to that, the timing was a bit of a slap in the face because the Chinese have put the Biden administration in a really tough spot. Unlike the domestic decision-making in Beijing, which is somewhat opaque, the US system demands transparency, and there is no way that the Chinese are not aware of the ongoing debates in DC on how to best manage US policies towards China. And there's no way that the Chinese are not aware of how much pressure the administration is from Republicans and others to get tough on Beijing. And they also are aware that President Biden has really tried to stand his ground and has said continuously, including yesterday, that managing competition with China means balancing deterrence needs across various domains with robust diplomacy to promote restraint and reduce risks. So because of all of that, I think that the US response to shoot down the balloon, but then to postpone the talks instead of suspending them or canceling them, was measured, and it took into consideration, what the US needed to do in terms of preserving any intelligence that the Chinese may have gathered on the US, and also balancing the domestic kind of conversation that Biden is having to very carefully navigate. And also, this was to send a message to the Chinese that these types of acts won't be tolerated.
Let's talk about Blinken's planned trip to Beijing that was ultimately canceled. What was it meant to do, and what have we lost by the fact that it's not going to happen?
Sure. So Blinken's trip was meant to follow up on the presidential summit that was held last November between Presidents Biden and Xi in Bali. I know Bali is known to be a vacation spot for newlyweds, but the US-China relationship was and still is nowhere near a honeymoon stage. And the meeting last fall was because it was pretty obvious that we needed some level of leader level course correction. I think the Biden administration had tried their best to get dialogue moving with China on various issues, but it was not going anywhere. I think the stark example was when Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin tried to contact his Chinese counterpart and wasn't able to for over a year. They subsequently then were able to get in touch and met in person, but still, I think that the presidential course correcting was important. And Blinken's trip was essentially to follow up on that now, a few months later. Since the trip was not necessarily canceled, but postponed, I think that nothing is lost yet. If anything, this is a moment of opportunity because we can make a very strong case for why diplomacy has to be a central element for our strategy towards China, because we have clearly not a strong enough ability to communicate effectively with the Chinese during a crisis. And imagine what this would look like in a conflict. Imagine what this would look like if nuclear weapons were at all involved. So I think that we should look at this less as a moment of crisis, but more as a moment of opportunity and figure out how, during this breathing room that it has now been created by force because of how the situation has played out, how we can use it to reflect. And that's exactly what the US ambassador to the UN said yesterday, that this is a moment of reflection. And that's what I'm most interested in seeing. But unfortunately, the way that it's playing out in the US media and within political and military circles isn't necessarily a moment of reflection, but it's being advanced in a way that is trying to make it a moment of inflection towards the things that would contain China more rather than trying to cooperate with China.
Now, in the midst of all this, news broke that China has more ICBM launchers than the United States, which, as we discussed, is true as far as it goes, but it leaves some critical information out. Where did this information come from, and what to you does it mean?
So Stratcom is required to make this determination pursuant to a congressional reporting requirement. The information did not come out because there was some sort of major revelation with strategic significance, but the way it's been reported on and also weaponized, for a lack of a better word, by some isn't helpful because it doesn't give us a complete picture, right? In fact, it obscures more than it reveals. I think Hans Christensen from the Federation of American Scientists put it extremely well over Twitter in 4 short bullet points. I can just quickly go through those because I think they are the best at encapsulating why it obscures more than it reveals. So the first thing is that most of the silos are not armed. A vast majority of the Chinese launchers in that total are currently empty. So they have no missiles, no available warheads. Second thing is that the Chinese do not have more ICBMs than the US. The third thing is that the Chinese do not have more ICBM warheads than the US. And the fourth and perhaps the most important point is that the assessment doesn't take into consideration the US's advantage in other domains. So, even if all the other silos were filled, China would still be quantitatively inferior to the entirety of the US nuclear force. And they're really a long way from warhead parity in terms of capacity. So that's the context. But in terms of your question regarding what does this mean, what I find most interesting is not the actual information that came out here or the information that was in the Pentagon's recent China military power report, but how this information is traveling, how it's being socialized to certain audiences, and as a result, what is being internalized by the American public and our leaders. So it's really important that we give a more thorough and full account that includes the wider context of how these ICBM launchers, fit in.
Well, as you say, this information has been weaponized, primarily to try to create the false impression that China is right at the doorstep, is reaching parity or has more weapons than the United States, and has prompted calls from some in Congress that the United States needs to increase its nuclear arsenal in response, which I think you would agree seems nonsensical. But what is your sense of all this?
Yeah, I think I can answer this in one sentence. Running towards nuclear weapons in response to espionage simply does not achieve any deterrence goals, change our adversaries' behavior, or make anyone safer.
So if Blinken is able to reschedule this trip to China, what are the most important things that the two sides need to discuss at this point?
Like I said, I really want this to be a reflection point rather than an inflection point. While Blinken takes stock of the situation, while the US political system comes to grips with the balloon incident and the ramifications of that, I think that what we need to be prioritizing are the lessons learned from what's just happened, which is that diplomacy is the only way that we're going to be able to manage the crises and potential conflicts that will emanate from the very clear ongoing competition between the US and China. And part of that, especially because both countries have nuclear weapons, is that we have to get some sort of process going that looks at strategic stability between the two countries and advances concrete risk reduction measures and arms control. Although the Chinese are very hesitant towards arms control, especially in terms of quantitative limits, there are still other things that we can talk to the Chinese about in terms of how both sides can offer mutual restraint. We can also decrease ambiguity. We can have conversations on threat perceptions. And although the US is still indeed talking to the Chinese through the P5 process, that has now been massively slowed down by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And it's been diluted because it's operating now at a more working level. So that process, although it was very useful to engage the Chinese, especially within the first 2 years of the Biden administration, it's more evident now than it has ever been before that a bilateral track is really necessary. And this most recent episode with the balloon is exactly why diplomacy on crisis management, risk reduction, and arms control is so important, because those things take time and we have to start somewhere. So in terms of priorities, I would really like to see amongst the huge, slew, the wide range of important topics for the US and China to discuss, that crisis management and communications in particular are at the top of the agenda.
Now, as much as talking is important, actions are important too. Are there actions that the United States could take on nuclear policy or how it postures its weapons that would help reduce tensions with China?
It's difficult to answer the question because I don't think that the US system has enough awareness of what the Chinese threat perceptions currently are based on. And I also don't think that we have enough awareness of how we can positively influence Chinese behaviors away from the current arms racing trajectory. So I think that an answer to that question would really require some robust dialogue between both sides, because it's not clear to me that there is any particular option in terms of shifting US nuclear posture or policies that would necessarily alleviate China's concerns to an extent that they themselves shift their strategy in a meaningful way to reduce US concerns. It's hard to find that sweet spot without really having everybody sit down at a table. And this is, again, why this bilateral conversation is so overdue and needed. And in the past, we'd had high level political commitments to dialogue across the Clinton, Bush, Obama administrations. But those really resulted in a handful of engagements, perhaps some site visits. We've tried this before, and we need to reflect on why it's failed time and time again. But we also need to realize that this time is different. And this time we're in a moment where if we don't get this right, we may not have an opportunity to do so for a long time. And during that period, the threats and the threat from China and the risks of the current relationship between the US and China will be heightened for no reason. There's a mutual interest to avoid an arms race. The US and China should not see arms racing as being in their interest. And we need to model leadership in heading off dangerous dynamics in the Indo-Pacific. So to do that, though, we need a willing partner. And socializing some of these concepts like risk reduction and arms control is going to be difficult to do with the Chinese, but it's going to be a necessary effort.
And Sahil, last question for you. Why are we seeing so much China threat inflation? And those are my words. You can tell me whether they're fair or not. And who do you think stands to benefit from this? And what can we do about it?
Look, I would not be being true to myself if I did not say that I feel that there are several issues at play in terms of the anti-Chinese sentiment that's growing in the US. And as a result, the sort of bashing and threat inflation that you talk about, I think there are very clear Orientalist and racist undertones to much of it. And as an Asian American, I am worried about how that translates in terms of the level of hatred and violence towards minority groups in the United States. And it's not right. In terms of how this plays out in a political sense, there probably will be many PhDs and books written about this moment and, about the ontological insecurity that a rising China will create within the US. But I think part of tearing with the fact that there is competition underway is acknowledging the fact that many US decision makers don't know much about the Chinese, their politics, their threat perceptions. And while China is opaque, it's not that opaque. Unlike the Soviets, though, who we knew well because we invested so much into understanding them and worked alongside them during the Second World War, we don't have much direct experience with the Chinese. So I think people who opt for threat inflation and bashing and whatnot, they see China's actions in a vacuum because they don't understand the wider context and they don't understand the other side. And then it becomes easy to inflate certain behavior to fill in the preconceived ideas they have and also provide justification for what they want to do. So it's a vicious cycle, but at the same time, we are lucky to have an administration right now that is not hell-bent on China bashing, on threat inflation, but they are hell-bent on trying to see the situation as clearly as possible, showcasing restraint and getting tough on China where and when it matters, but in a smart way that holds Beijing to account, whilst also offering room for diplomacy to reduce risk and to also find common ground. So my hope is that the Biden administration continues to have the political courage to stand its ground, because the alternative approaches look far less conducive to making progress. We've seen before what happens when US-China dialogue is stood up and then it falls back down. It stands up, then it falls back down. So I hope that the Biden administration continues to have the political courage to stand its ground and put diplomacy first and make it a central element of its wider strategy with China.
Sahil, great to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time and best of luck in all your work.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett, Angela Kellett, and Alex Hall. Audio engineering in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyric Spawn and Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.